Welcome to AI Paper Slap. Today we're tearing into a paper called Latent Thought Flow, Efficient Latent Reasoning in Large Language Models by researchers from SMU and Ant Group. Let's get straight to the core insight.
Yeah, let's dive in.
So right now, explicit chain of thought reasoning is, well, it's incredibly slow and expensive. The authors call this the linguistic space bottleneck.
Right, meaning an LLM has to basically decode every single intermediate thought into human-readable text before it can finally arrive at an answer.
Exactly. And previous attempts to fix this, by hiding the computation in the model's continuous hidden states, they either forced these rigid deterministic paths or they used reinforcement learning.
Which, as we know, usually causes the model to collapse into using just a few repetitive reasoning modes.
Yeah, which isn't great. So this paper introduces latent thought flow, or LTF. It models reasoning as variable length continuous trajectories and uses a continuous GFlowNet to balance accuracy with computational cost.
And the empirical results are massive. We're talking a 9.5% boost in accuracy.
And a 27.2% reduction in reasoning length compared to state-of-the-art latent baselines. I mean, think of explicit chain of thought, like a student who's forced to show every single line of their algebra homework on a chalkboard, right? Token by token.
Oh, I love that analogy.
Yeah, and LTF is like letting that student do the math efficiently in their head, dynamically deciding how much mental effort to use, and only writing down the final answer. It saves massive amounts of time and board space.
Absolutely. And to really appreciate the engineering breakthrough here, we need to look at why the ML community is hitting a wall with our current reasoning paradigms.
Because if you're building AI pipelines today, you're probably relying heavily on explicit reasoning framework.
Right, things like standard chain of thought prompting, self-consistency, or tree of thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And we use them because they are genuinely fantastic at decomposing intricate problems.
Like advanced math or complex code generation.
Exactly, breaking them down into sequential rationales. But they come with a brutal accuracy-efficiency trade-off.
Mainly because of the autoregressive nature of LLMs, right? You have to generate every single token sequentially, one by one.
Yeah, and since every generated token requires a full forward pass through the network, the compute cost scales linearly with the length of the thought process.
Which means the model is forced to externalize its entire internal deliberation as discrete text.
That incurs a massive inference overhead. But beyond just the compute cost, it forces the internal computation into a potentially redundant, verbose textual form.
Right, because human language is actually a very inefficient medium for mathematical or logical computation.
It really is. So these explicit methods work beautifully in a theoretical, unconstrained setting, but they scale terribly when you actually have to deploy them in resource-constrained environments.
And that bottleneck is what led to the first wave of latent reasoning solutions, right? I'm thinking of methods like pause tokens.
Oh yeah, where you just append a bunch of dummy tokens to give the model extra hidden computation steps before decoding.
Exactly. Or architectures like Coconut, which use explicit to implicit training. The goal there was to internalize the multi-step compute into the continuous hidden state space, so you just don't have to pay for generating all those textual tokens.
Right, and those early latent methods were vital because they proved a core concept. Meaningful intermediate computation does not always need to be expressed in linguistic words.
An LLM can sort of think in its native high-dimensional vector space.
Yeah. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, those first-generation latent models lacked a distributional view.
Wait, what do you mean by a distributional view?
Well, whenever an LLM is given a complex question, it has to navigate a massive manifold of plausible reasoning paths. Out of all possible ways to solve a problem, only a very sparse subset of those paths is going to yield logical consistency, and an even smaller subset will be computationally efficient. Those earlier models just didn't have a way to map out or understand that distribution of paths.
So how were they navigating the latent space if they couldn't see the different viable routes?
They were mostly brute forcing it in two ways. They either learned highly deterministic paths via compression,
Essentially memorizing a single rigid way to process certain types of questions.
Exactly. Or they use standard reinforcement learning algorithms like GRPO. And when you apply standard RL under a fixed computational budget to a complex reasoning task, you tend to trigger something called posterior collapse.
I know posterior collapse is a major headache in generative modeling, but what does it look like in the specific context of reasoning?
It means the model discovers one or two reasoning paths that yield a high reward during training, and it just collapses its probability distribution onto those specific modes.
Oh, so it learns a single best path and completely ignores the rest of the latent space.
Yeah, pretty much. Wait, I need to push back on that. If reinforcement learning maximizes the reward and the model consistently gets the right answer by using that one path, why is collapsing to a few high-reward paths a bad thing?
I mean, that makes sense on the surface.
Right, like in math, isn't the right answer just the right answer? If it works, it works. It works for accuracy, sure, but it completely destroys efficiency. You have to consider that different questions have wildly different baseline computational costs.
Okay, fair.
If you ask a model, what is 2 plus 2, it shouldn't need the same amount of internal computation as asking it to solve a multivariable calculus problem.
Yeah, that would be overkill.
Right. But if the model is collapsed to a single high-reward mode via RL, it applies that same intensive, deep reasoning path to everything. It doesn't know how to adapt its effort.
Ah, so it's using a sledgehammer to crack a nut just because the sledgehammer got a high reward previously.
That's it, exactly.
Yeah.
To solve this, you need a principled sampler that can dynamically allocate compute budgets based on the specific difficulty of the question at hand.
You don't want a system that just spams the same path.
No, you want a system that inherently acknowledges that many paths work, but some are vastly cheaper than others, and the choice of path should depend on the input.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because since maximizing a single path via RL fails to capture that nuance of varying computational costs, the authors propose a totally different mathematical approach.
Yes, they do.
This is where Latent Thought Flow, or LTF, comes in, modeling a reward proportional probability distribution using continuous GFlowNets.
Right, so latent thought flow replaces those explicit textual rationales with an adaptive latent reasoning process. The architecture is really elegant.
How does it work under the hood?
For a given question, which we'll call X, LTF samples a variable length's trajectory. In the paper, this is denoted as a sequence of Z states, from step 1 to capital T, ending with a termination symbol, which is represented by the bottom symbol.
Okay, let's break those terms down for the engineers listening. Each Z state is a continuous thought state.
Correct.
So instead of a token like the word therefore, it's a high-dimensional continuous vector representing a step in the reasoning process, living entirely inside the LLM's latent space.
And that termination symbol, the bottom symbol, is critical. It represents an adaptive stopping decision.
Oh, interesting. So the model is dynamically learning how much to reason internally before it finally decides it has accumulated enough logical certainty to produce the final text answer.
Exactly. And during training, the target answer defines a utility or reward function that governs this whole process.
And that reward function isn't just grading the final answer, right? It combines two competing incentives, the answer quality and a strict computation cost penalty.
Yeah, the utility combines a verifier term, which is basically a binary check of whether the final generated answer matches the ground truth.
Right.
And it combines that with a normalized likelihood term. The likelihood term ensures the training signal is dense, giving the model gradient information even if the final answer isn't perfectly right. But the reasoning was heading in a plausible direction.
Makes sense. But the real magic is the cost penalty, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. By default, the authors set this penalty simply as the length of the latent trajectory, T.
So every additional Z state the model takes incurs a penalty. It naturally favors shorter latent trajectories unless spending more internal computation actually results in a better answer.
Yeah, it creates an evolutionary pressure for efficiency. And this is exactly where the continuous GFlowNet comes into play.
Right, generative flow networks.
Yes, GFlowNets are designed to learn stochastic generative policies where the probability of sampling a terminal state is directly proportional to its unnormalized reward.
So it's less like training a GPS to blindly memorize the single fastest highway route and more like giving the GPS a fluid probability map of all viable routes.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Allowing it to dynamically pick a path that perfectly balances getting to the destination accurately with burning the least amount of gas based on the current traffic.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it. Instead of finding one optimal path and collapsing onto it like standard RL, LTF trains a sampler to match a target distribution.
And in this distribution, multiple correct and efficient trajectories coexist.
Exactly. The GFlowNet actively shapes the probability landscape, suppressing and assigning very low probability mass to paths that lead to incorrect answers or paths that are just redundantly long.
But, you know, conceptualizing a fluid, continuous probability map on a whiteboard is one thing. Actually training it in a high-dimensional, continuous space inside an LLM is notoriously unstable.
You know, it's incredibly difficult.
How did the authors engineer this to actually work? Because the paper outlines 3 major technical optimization hurdles they had to clear to prevent the model from just outputting garbage.
Well, the first major hurdle is sparse supervision. If you think about the architecture, the model is reasoning entirely in an unobserved latent vector space.
Right. You only know if the reasoning actually worked at the very end of the trajectory, when the final answer is decoded from the last latent state into text and checked against the training dataset.
Yeah, you have absolutely no token-level supervision to tell you if step 3 of your internal continuous math was mathematically sound. You only have the final grade.
So how do you train that intermediate space?
To solve this, the authors utilized a subtrajectory balance objective. Because LTF allows every intermediate prefix state to potentially terminate during training, they can artificially stop the model at any latent step.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they force it to decode an answer from that premature state and calculate a reward.
So they are basically saying, stop thinking right now. What's your best guess based on the latent thought you hold at this exact millisecond?
Exactly. And by doing that across the entire trajectory, the subtrajectory balance objective enforces flow consistency.
It allows the model to propagate those terminal rewards back to the intermediate latent steps,
Providing a dense training signal even when the latent space itself is completely unobservable.
That is such a clever workaround. But then they ran into the second challenge, which they call uniformity.
Right. Treating all of those subtrajectories equally across a complex reasoning path turns out to be highly inefficient.
So they introduced something called entropy-weighted subtrajectory balance, or EW sub TB.
Yes. This modifies the training so that the model reweights the residuals, assigning larger training weights to high entropy subtrajectories.
Hold on, I need some clarification here. If we're trying to make the model highly efficient, highly accurate, and very decisive, why are we giving more training weight to the high entropy parts of the reasoning?
I know, it sounds weird.
Doesn't high entropy just mean the model's probability distribution is flat, meaning it's uncertain or confused?
It sounds completely counterintuitive until you analyze the latent dynamics of how these continuous vectors hold information. The authors discovered what we can call an effective entropy regime.
Okay, what does that mean?
Well, if the entropy of a subtrajectory is too low, which is what happens in the Kohler baseline model they tested against, it means the latent reasoning trajectories are highly deterministic.
So low entropy means it has stubbornly memorized a narrow path, like we talked about earlier with posterior collapse.
Yes. And when it collapses like that, it severely limits the amount of information contained in the latent path, which completely weakens the model's ability to generalize to unseen problems.
I see.
But high entropy, up to a certain threshold at least, corresponds to regions in the latent space with a much richer spread of information across many dimensions.
Because if it's holding multiple possibilities or features in its continuous state simultaneously, the entropy is naturally higher.
You've got it. It reflects diverse, less redundant features. By giving more training weight to these higher entropy subtrajectories, the model gets stronger supervision exactly in the regions where it is exploring a wider, more informative set of reasoning features.
It ensures diverse, structured information processing.
Right. Now, the paper notes that if the entropy gets too high, it just becomes purely stochastic noise. But within that effective regime, waiting for higher entropy forces the model to learn robust generalizations rather than brittle memorization.
That transitions perfectly into the third technical challenge, unconstrained exploration.
Yeah, this is a big one.
Because if you just let a model freely explore a continuous latent space from scratch, particularly a high entropy space, it can easily drift into meaningless hallucinated states early in training.
States that have absolutely no semantic connection to the problem you asked it to solve.
Exactly. So how did they fix that?
To prevent that drift, LTF uses a reference prior regularizer. When the researchers have access to teacher-generated explicit reasoning traces in the training data.
Basically, high-quality text showing how a human or a larger model would solve the problem step by step.
Yeah, they use those traces to warm start the LTF model.
It's like putting training wheels on the latent space.
Totally. They introduce a reference branch that anchors the early latent exploration to these modality-aligned, semantically meaningful regions of the continuous space. It forces the model to stay grounded in logic initially.
And then they use annealing. As the training progresses, they gradually relax that reference constraint.
This slowly takes the training wheels off.
allowing the accuracy efficiency GFlowNet reward to fully take over and shape the trajectories to become much more concise than the original teacher text.
It ensures stability at the beginning, but preserves the continuous efficiency gains at the end.
So, in theory, this architecture brilliantly solves the linguistic bottleneck. But, the AI graveyard is full of architectures that look beautiful on a whiteboard and completely fail on a GPU.
Very true.
Did this actually survive real-world math benchmarks? What did they test this on?
The empirical payoff here is substantial. They evaluated LTF across several robust LLM backbones. They used Llama 3.2 at the 1 billion and 3 billion parameter scales.
Okay, solid baselines.
They also used Llama 3.1 at 8 billion parameters, and importantly, the DeepSeek R1 Distill Quinn 1.5 billion model.
Oh, DeepSeek R1 is known for being heavily optimized for reasoning, so that's a great baseline to test against. What data sets did they run these on?
They ran them on heavy reasoning benchmarks. GSMA-KOG for grade school math, ASEVOG for diverse math word problems, and a data understanding dataset called DU.
Nice.
They also tested the model's ability to transfer its learning to outer domain datasets like SVMP and the math benchmark, which contains much harder competition-level problems.
Well, I'm looking at the numbers, and they are genuinely standout. LTF consistently beat strong latent baselines like coconut, Kohler, and regular.
Oh, yeah.
If we look at the 1B LMI model on the GSMA-K dataset, LTF pushed the average accuracy from 34.58%, which was achieved by the best baseline, regular, up to 37.09%.
And crucially, it achieved that accuracy bump while dropping the average reasoning length from 3.69 latent steps down to the 3.34.
It became more accurate, and it used significantly less compute to get there.
It adapted its latent budget perfectly to the difficulty of the questions. We also saw this robust scalability across the larger backbones.
How did the bigger models do?
On the 8B Llama model, average accuracy went from 50.14% up to 53.14%, again accompanied by a reduction in average reasoning length.
One of the most fascinating experiments in the paper is what they call extreme compression.
Yes, I love this part.
They essentially tortured the models by forcing them to compress their entire reasoning process to a length of exactly one. Just a single latent thought step before outputting the answer.
And even under that extreme computational constraint, LTF vastly outperformed the baselines. On the math dataset with the 1B model, regular hit 6.62% accuracy. LTF hit 8.10%.
Wow. That performance under extreme compression is a direct result of the entropy-weighted GFlowNet training we discussed, isn't it?
Yeah, because the model isn't just memorizing paths. It learns how to pack the most vital reward-maximizing features into whatever latent space budget it is given. It preserves critical semantic information far better than RL methods.
There is another angle they tested that engineers are going to care about for real-world deployment: test time scaling.
Right.
This is the idea that if you give the model a larger inference compute budget at test time, you can sample multiple latent chains in parallel.
The authors sampled up to 10 parallel latent chains in their experiments, and doing that boosted the accuracy on the 1B model from 59.68% to 62.13%.
But here's where it gets really interesting. If we scale up at test time by sampling 10 entire reasoning chains, aren't we just completely undoing the efficiency we fought so hard to gain?
It seems like it, right.
Yeah, doesn't running 10 chains explode the compute cost right back up to the level of explicit text decoding?
It sounds like it would, but you have to compare the actual floating point operations. Generating 10 highly compact parallel latent vectors is still drastically cheaper than decoding a massive wall of discrete chain-of-thought text token by token.
Oh, I see.
The continuous transition step in the latent space requires a fraction of the overhead of full autoregressive text generation.
Because you aren't calculating probabilities over a vocabulary of 100,000 words for every single step.
That's exactly right. Furthermore, when they scaled up to sample 10 chains, the average reasoning length of those chains barely budged. It went from 1.91 steps to just 1.93 steps.
So you are sampling multiple, very short, very cheap internal thoughts and having the model choose the best one rather than forcing it to write a tedious sequential essay.
Precisely.
It's just incredible to see how this redefines the fundamental mechanics of inference. To summarize the paradigm shift we are looking at today, we are officially moving away from models that talk themselves through a problem via text.
Yeah, we are moving toward models that organically flow through mathematical probability spaces.
Balancing the quality of their internal thoughts with the strict cost of their compute budget. It's faster, it's cheaper, and as Latent Thought Flow proves, it is demonstrably more accurate.
It represents a fundamental maturation in how we treat LLM architecture. For years, we've been forcing models to mimic human step-by-step writing because that's how we understand logic.
Right.
But we are finally letting them compute in the native, continuous language of their own latent space.
Well, thank you for tuning in to this deep dive on AI paper slop. We like to leave you with a final thought to mull over. And looking at the implications of latent thought flow, there is a massive puzzle waiting for the engineering community.
For sure.
If future LLMs achieve their absolute best accuracy and efficiency entirely in a continuous, non-linguistic latent space, they won't be thinking out loud anymore.
Yeah.
As ML engineers, how will we interpret, debug, or audit the reasoning of a model when its internal thoughts are completely untranslatable to human language? We'll see you next time.